Hello and welcome to Games Past their Prime. This is a show where I take a look at video games and determine if they are past their prime or not. For me to do so, though, there is a couple categories which I look at. Story, presentation, which includes both music and graphics, gameplay, and then there's a conclusion section which will put everything together in a nice little bow. You guys already know what game we're playing. You've already seen the title. Let's take a look at 007 GoldenEye. The story of GoldenEye follows the same story as the movie as best as it can. So for those of you who don't know the story, I will try to summarize the plot of the movie as best as I can. I will also try to avoid major spoilers until the end of the video, but just know that this is one of your spoiler warnings right now. In 1986, James Bond and Alec Trevelyan, both MI6 operatives, were tasked with infiltrating a chemical weapons facility where they were to plant explosives to take out the chemicals being stored. During the mission, Trevelyan ended up being captured and killed by Colonel Orimov. I'm gonna butcher this name every time I say it, so I warn you now. Thankfully, Bond was able to escape the facility as it exploded. The story then moves 9 years into the future of 1995. Ooh, future! During this time, a new group has popped up named the Janus Crime Syndicate. A member of this group named Xenia Onatop has formed a relationship with a well-known admiral. Xenia ends up killing the admiral to steal his credentials to board a French Navy destroyer to steal a Tiger attack helicopter. It turns out that Colonel Orimov is also now working for Janus, and both Xenia and the Colonel fly the helicopter to a remote bunker in Siberia. Once they enter the bunker, they proceed to kill the entire staff and steal the control disk for the GoldenEye satellites, which are two electromagnetic pulse weapons that were designed during the Cold War. The Janus Syndicate used the first satellite to destroy the bunker and to disable any Russian Air Force fighters in the area. This allows them to escape with not only the control disk, but also a computer programmer named Boris. After the attack, a survivor named Natalia tries to contact Boris and arranges to meet him in St. Petersburg, where he betrays her and gives her up to Janus. M then assigns the mission to 007, and now it's up to James Bond to figure out what's going on. Now then, let's take a look at those graphics. Wow. That is a little rough around the edges. Whoa, wait a minute. Is that supposed to look like Pierce Brosnan? Whew. And is that supposed to be Alec Trevelyan? And is he supposed to look like Sean Bean? I know he was the actor that played that character, but man, that is rough. No wonder Alec died so early. All jokes aside, while the graphics are a bit rough, I commend them for being able to make it look somewhat decent on N64 hardware. The game came out in 1997. I mean, that is fairly impressive that they were able to make a FPS at that time to look this decent with fairly decent sized maps. Even still though, while it is commendable that they were able to do this on N64 hardware, the graphics clearly have not aged well. The colors look a bit muted and washed out, all the models look like they could cut me if I even touched them, and the textures are, well, fairly low res when you get up close to them. I know there was some intention when it comes to the color palette and choices that were made. They wanted the game to match up with the dark theme of the movie, but all it really did was end up looking like the textures are blurring into another, and that can be a bit confusing on the eye. An example of this is when you are trying to proceed through a mission, but then you get stuck because you end up needing a keycard to continue through a locked door. Thinking logically that you must have missed a room that had the key, you start to backtrack looking through all the areas you have been in and looking for another room. Then you come to find out that it was on a guard that you had already killed, and the keycard is on the floor in a spot you had to have run over at least a dozen times by now. But somehow, there it is, on the floor. And it's blending into the body, so you can't properly see it. This is partially a gameplay issue, but I'm tagging it in the presentation section just because it embodies my issue with the graphics really well. Now let's talk about the maps. See, these maps are fairly decent sized, and some of them are even outdoors. However, we are playing on an N64, And this game is trying to be a fully 3D FPS, which doesn't exactly work the best on the N64. So how did they do it? Well, during the maps outdoors, to make it not noticeable there was any pop-in, they instead added fog, which is a smart idea since it limits how much can be displayed at once and thus allows a game like this to be run on an N64. However, there is one problem. The game seems to always render the enemies regardless if they are past the fog or not, so there has been a couple of times I've been shot or shot at through that fog by an enemy that I cannot see, which can be rather frustrating and there isn't much you can do about it either. However, while the graphics leave much to be desired, the music. Man, the music and sound design of this game is out of this world. I absolutely fell in love with the soundtrack of this game. It's got great bumping action tracks and low stealth-like music where it's there, but you don't really notice it since it's not being loud and over the top like the action tracks. It just has a great blend of action tracks to just the background tracks, and it does an amazing job matching the right track to any given situation you find yourself in. Here, let me play a couple tracks for you just so you get an idea of what I'm talking about. 007 GoldenEye is an FPS game with stealth-based options. Now, while this game is an FPS game, it isn't by any means a modern FPS. Remember, this is 1997 on an N64. Unless you were playing games on PC, there wasn't many options for FPS games. Now, since we are playing on an N64, the developer of 007 GoldenEye, who in case you didn't know happens to be Rare, the company that also made Banjo-Kazooie, had to figure out a way to make an FPS work on this type of controller. It doesn't have twin sticks, so how does it work? Well, if I'm being honest, the controls are unique. There are different controller setups provided in the options, but I'll just be covering the standard button layout that somebody would experience the first time they boot up the game. The control stick moves the character forward or backward when the stick is moved in those directions. When you move the stick to the left or right, it will not move your character, but instead will allow you to turn your character. Now, because they don't have a dedicated stick to help with aiming, they had to map them to buttons. So, the C button up allows you to look up, and the C button down allows you to look down. The left C button allows you to strafe to your left, while the right C button allows you to strafe to your right. The Z button on the bottom of the controller ends up being the fire weapon button, while the B button is your interact button. Then if you'd like to, you can use the aim mode by holding down the right bumper on top of the controller. This allows you to do more precision aiming, since when you do this it brings up a reticle on the screen, which is just moved around using the stick. Do note, however, that while you are in aim mode, you may only move by using the strafe buttons C left or C right. Now, these sound like really wonky controls for an FPS, but what they did to try and help accommodate these controls is something called auto-aim. It does exactly what it implies it does. As you get close to an enemy, the auto-aim will kick in and point the gun in the direction of the enemy. You then can shoot and kill that enemy. This more or less means that if you do not wish to take your time being stealthy, you could, in theory, just run through the level holding down the fire button as it auto-locks to enemies and kills them. This is probably the best way they could have handled an FPS on the N64, and the controls do take some time to get used to, but overall it isn't that bad, and I have played games with worse controls in the past. This game doesn't hold your hand, which I both love and hate at times. There are a certain amount of hand-holding I don't mind in my games, such as hints or something in-game telling me I may have something in my inventory that can help out. Now, I don't want these tips all the time, but if I happen to be moving around a level, lost on what to do, a hint would be nice. This game doesn't do that, and even if you read through the objectives of what you're supposed to do and read through the files before you start a mission, it can still be a little obscure as to what you have to do. For example, this reminds me of a mission where at one point you need to get rid of the alarm systems. Well, to do that, of course, you just blow up the alarms on the wall. Then, later you get another mission where you need to disrupt the communications of a base. So you look around and find where the computer is for communications, so obviously you must need to destroy it, right? Wrong. You first need to find a key card off a dead guy's body that allows you to shut off the communications. This was never explained anywhere. You're just expected to know it. So they teach you one way, then decide they're going to have a new way for you to do a very similar task. It's trial error stuff like this that really bothers me in video games. Spoilers going forward. I want this to be very clear. There are spoilers, and if you want to skip this, look for the time on screen. Alright, so after a brief moment, Bond ends up meeting with a former KGB agent who helps to arrange a meeting with the head of Janus. Bond goes on to meet this person and finds out it's Trevlin. Dun dun dun! Trevlin goes on to explain that he is part of the Cossack clan who collaborated with the Axis powers and that he has vowed revenge after the British betrayed his people, which led to his parents' suicide. Bond ends up unconscious due to a tranq dart, and when he wakes up he is with Natalia in a helicopter that is going to explode. After they escape the helicopter, they end up being captured and moved to the Russian military archives to be interrogated. Ormarov shows up killing the Minister of Defense and plans to frame Bond as the murderer. Bond and Natalia attempt to escape, but during the fight, Ormarov captures Natalia and takes her back to Trevlin's missile train. Bond ends up tracking them down and killing Ormarov, but Trevlin escapes the train and rigs it to explode. Bond and Natalia now need to end up escaping the train before it explodes and find out that the satellite dish is somewhere in Cuba. Bond and Natalia end up borrowing a plane to search Cuba for the satellite, but end up being shot down in the jungle. As they try to escape the jungle, they run into Xenia, who had shot them down. After a brief firefight, Bond ends up killing Xenia and continues looking for where the Janus group are hiding. After a short time, they end up finding where the satellite dish is being held and they continue to infiltrate the control station. However, Bond ends up being captured in the process. Trevlin talks about his plans with Bond, that he wishes to rob the Bank of England and then erasing all of its financial records using the second GoldenEye satellite. This in turn would conceal the theft that took place while also destroying Britain's economy. Natalia during this time was able to program the satellite for atmospheric re-entry, which would end up destroying the satellite. Trevlin ends up capturing Natalia and orders Boris, the computer programmer, to save the satellite. During this, Bond is able to escape and make his way to the antenna cradle. He sabotages the antenna to have a system overload, which would prevent Boris from regaining control over the satellite. Bond and Trevlin end up in a fight to the death. Bond manages to push Trevlin off the cradle where he falls into the dish, which causes the cradle to explode. Natalia ends up borrowing a helicopter, which she uses to fly up to where Bond is so that he can jump into the helicopter and escape before the whole cradle explodes. Now with the story finished, let's move on to the verdict. The verdict of 007 GoldenEye is a game past its prime. Listen, this was actually a pretty tough choice, as I remember all the fun times I had growing up and playing this game with friends. However, I think looking back at it, it has flaws, and ones that I just couldn't help but notice. Let's take a look at the top reasons as to why I made this choice. Number 1. While the music is amazing, the graphics have not aged well, and the colors look too muted and dull. Some areas tend to look the same, and I sometimes just felt lost inside some of these levels. Number 2. The game doesn't hold your hand, but not only does it not hold your hand, it does it in kind of a bad way. It gives you ideas on what to do before the mission starts, but after that you're just left to figure it out on your own, which can lead you to wandering around not really sure how to progress sometimes. Number 3. While I think the story is really well done, I can't credit the game for this. Not only does the game's story come from a movie, but it doesn't exactly tell you the story unless you want to go looking for it and read all of the details before the mission starts. Number 4. The controls are okay for the time period they were made, but man, coming back to it is just a bit rough. It doesn't feel natural to play an FPS like this anymore. I give credit where credit is due, but it just felt like I never had a full handle on the controls. Number 5. Honestly, about halfway through the game, I stopped having fun. It was a combination of the controls and the aimlessness of certain levels that just really took it out of me, and I only finished the game just for this video, and if that's not a good enough reason, I don't know what is. Alright, so that's the end of the video. I want to thank everyone for watching the video, and I really want to thank my friends and family for still continuing to support my channel. I hope you guys enjoyed watching the video as much as I enjoyed making it, and I hope you all have an excellent day.